Hello and welcome to the webinar, everybody. We're a few minutes before the hour, so we're going to give it a couple minutes to allow everybody to join us. But while y'all are waiting to start the webinar, I'm going to open up a poll. And if you can take some time to answer that question, that will help us best put this presentation together and learn what y'all are, how familiar y'all are with fringe benefits. So take some time, fill out the poll, and we'll get started here at the top of the hour. All right, hello everybody. We are now at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know people are still working their way in, so I'll slow roll us into the start of this. If you're just joining us, feel free to take a moment and fill out the poll asking to what extent you're familiar with fringe transportation benefits. That will help us best build this presentation to fit what y'all's needs are. I'll give it 1 minute and then I'll present the results to all, and then we can get the presentation started. Thank you guys for joining us.
Anton, do you want us sharing our video?
If you're comfortable doing that, that'd be great.
I just didn't want to slow things down.
Yeah, it's up to you. I think I find it helpful, but you know, I'm not going to force you.
Maybe I'll start and then turn it off.
Yeah, let me turn mine on.
And you see the typo in them polls, right?
Yeah, but I would have to go back online and fix that.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay.
All right, I'm going to close the poll now and share our results. All right, so it looks like we are some pretty evenly distributed across the board with how familiar folks are with fringe transportation benefits. So hopefully everybody will learn something from this. Maybe some will learn a little bit more than others, but hopefully we can build this presentation in a way that everybody feels like they're getting some pretty good and useful information as we move forward. But with that, I'm going ahead and hide the results and get us started with our presentation. So, welcome to Movability's Commuter Tax webinar. My name is Anton Cox, and as we get started, I'll just do some quick housekeeping, some frequently asked questions about Movability and about the platform we're using for today's webinar. So Movability is a TMA located in Austin, Texas, representing the Central Texas region here in Austin, including around 6 counties here in the region. We work with employers mainly to help build commuter plans, help facilitate conversation, connect them with providers, things like that. Feel free to ask me or our team any questions about Movability or any of the things that we have going on. We're happy to share any information with our fellow counterparts, either here within the region or across the nation or across the world. How does GoToMeeting work? Everyone's going to be on listen-only mode. If you have any questions, any concerns, feel free to type that into the Q&A section. We are hoping to get to all of your questions towards the end of the presentation, but feel free to type in your question at any point during the presentation. Will this webinar be recorded? Yes, we are going to be recording these webinars, so if you have any questions, concerns that are, or you want to come back to this and kind of review what we've talked about, feel free to check out the recording, and we will post that as soon as possible on our website and likely on our YouTube channel. So just going quickly over some things that Movability has going on here in the Austin region. Right now we are launching our Go Grant program, which is a micro grant program for small local businesses to help them build in some mobility services at their location. Right now we're doing grants for shared transportation, things like transit, van pools, for carpools, anything to incentivize shared mobility options. Also, May is Bike Month, so we have a bike ATX passport where we're working with small local businesses to provide discounts to some of our small businesses if you go and visit them throughout the month of May, which starts tomorrow, I believe. So if you are here local, please check them out. You can find out more information on our website. If you have them stamp your passport with all 6 of these locations, you can be entered into a raffle to win some cool prizes from a couple of our sponsors. And like always, we want to thank our lead partners. They make this possible, the City of Austin, Cap Metro, and the Downtown Austin Alliance, as well as our pioneering partner, the Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority. Now moving on to the presentation, I want to introduce our speakers. Our first is going to be Glenn Lewis. He is a CPA at Maxwell Lock and Ritter, and he is also a Movability board member. He is the treasurer of our board. We are so happy to have him. Who better to serve as a treasurer than an accountant? In addition, we also have Phil Winters from the Center for Urban Transportation Research, or Cutter, which is a little bit easier to say, at the University of South Florida. He'll be bringing a lot of research and analysis to the presentation for you guys. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Glenn to start the presentation. Glenn, feel free to take it away.
All right, thanks, Anton. I'm going to try to present this. There's actually just an enormous amount of information in regard to qualified transportation fringe benefits out there. And so today, I think just in interest of time, for nothing else, we're going to probably keep it at a fairly high level. But I've got my contact information here. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, or want to drill down in anything specific that maybe we don't have time to get in today, I want everyone to feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to go ahead and dropped my camera, everyone knows what I look like now, so we can focus on the presentation. So as an overview, what we're going to cover today is providing qualified transportation fringe benefits, including providing commuter transportation and transit passes. We're going to talk about qualified parking benefits, and then we will have some time at the end of my presentation for some questions. We can go ahead and move on. Qualified transportation benefits include transportation in a commuter highway vehicle. Now, there's a specific definition for what constitutes a commuter highway vehicle, and we'll touch on that in a minute. It also includes transit passes and qualified parking. Now, for anyone who is a bike rider, for tax years beginning before 2018, which is kind of irrelevant at this point, or after 2025, reimbursements for qualified bicycle commuting expenses are going to be qualified transportation benefits. The bad news is for tax years 2018 through 2025, any employee who is reimbursed for bicycle commuting expenses, that will be taxable compensation to the employee. One other note is the transportation in a commuter highway vehicle and transit passes are basically lumped together when it comes to determining the benefit limitations, and that'll make a little more sense here in just a minute. So transportation in a commuter highway vehicle. Commuter transportation is a qualified transportation benefit if it's provided by an employer to an employee for travel in a commuter highway vehicle, or CHV, between the employee's residence or a parking lot where the employee is picked up by the vehicle and the place of employment. The definition, basically, there is what's called the 80-50 rule. So a commuter highway vehicle is one in which there's seating capacity for at least 6 adults, not including the driver, and at least 80% of the usage of the vehicle can reasonably be expected to be for transporting employees between their residences and their place of employment. In addition, trips during which employees are being transported, at least 50% of the adult seating capacity must be occupied, but you can't include the driver in that. A van pool, a similar concept, is a qualified transportation benefit if the van that's being used meets the definition of a commuter highway vehicle. So it'd be subject to the same 80-50 rule. Okay. Transit passes. This may be one that's, in my experience, probably most frequently utilized. But a transit pass is any pass, token, fare card, voucher, or similar item entitling a person to transportation, either free of charge because they have the item, or at a reduced rate on mass transit, whether or not publicly owned, or in a vehicle seating at least 6 adults, not including the driver, provided by a person in the business of transporting persons for pay. Employers can distribute a transit pass to an employee with a value equal to or less than the monthly exclusion amount, which currently for 2021 is $270 per month, without requiring any substantiation from the employee. The value of a monthly pass that is in excess of the exclusion amount must be included in the employee's compensation. So basically what that means, currently, the benefit limit is $270 per month. If an employer provided an employee with a transit pass that had a value of $300 per month, the employee would have $30 per month of taxable compensation. One thing that's a little bit different about transit passes is they can be distributed in advance. Typically, other expenses related to qualified transportation benefits can't be paid in advance on behalf of the employee. Transit passes, they have a little more flexibility. They can be distributed more than a month in advance, but not more than 12 months in advance. Parking actually is much more complicated than the transit passes or the commuter highway vehicles or van pools. The definition of qualified parking is it's parking that's provided to an employee on or near the employer's business premises or at a location from which the employee commutes to work by carpool, commuter vehicle, highway vehicle, or mass transit. Now, on or near means the employer's, on or near an employer's business premises includes parking on or near a work location at which the employee provides services to the employer, including a work location away from the employer's main business premises if that employee is there on a long-term basis. So here's an example. Let's say an employee is working on a project which requires them to be off-site at a client location for an extended period of time. That would qualify as the employer's business premises. Now, a similar situation, but maybe the employee is only going out to a client site for a day or two, that would not qualify as being near an employer's business premises, and you wouldn't have a chance to utilize any type of qualified parking benefit for that. And then, of course, the qualified parking does not include parking on or near property used by the employee for residential purposes. Most often, an employer will provide qualified parking through a compensation reduction agreement, but it can also be provided through a reimbursement arrangement, and we'll talk about the differences between those here in a few minutes. In terms of valuing the qualified parking benefit, if an employer pays a third party for parking spaces for its employees, essentially the total value, which would be divided by the employees that are utilizing it, is just the cost of what the employer pays to the third party. And that's regardless of how many employees actually use the spaces. That's pretty straightforward, and that's the easy one. This one is a little more complex. The next one, if an employer owns or leases parking facilities where employees park, the employer first has to determine the total parking expenses for each facility. And total parking expenses includes things like maintenance, if there's a security guard. There's a lot of things other than just the cost of, they buy a parking lot or lease a parking lot and let their employees park there. Then the total expenses are allocated to spaces used primarily by employees, and that determines the amount of the both the value of the benefit and what potentially would be disallowed, for the employer. Now, one thing, step back for we're probably maybe talking here to both nonprofit entities and for-profit entities, and so when we're talking about things about expenses being disallowed for the employer, that's obviously much less of an issue for a nonprofit who's not looking for a tax deduction anyway, typically. An interesting story, the most recent Tax Act, the big one from a couple of years ago, a really quirky thing kind of came out of that, and it particularly impacted nonprofits. And so what happened was, if a nonprofit was providing parking for its employees, its total parking costs actually had to be treated as income, and they had to pay tax on it. So in other words, if you had $25,000 of parking costs, you had to report that on a Form 990T as income and pay 21% tax on it. No one knew how that got into the bill in the first place, and in a rare example of bipartisan cooperation in Washington, very shortly after the act was passed, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle realized that was like a really dumb thing. It took them a year, but they did get rid of it retroactively. Now, it created some headaches for a lot of nonprofits, because first they had to file a 990T, report this qualified parking income, even though it actually was an expense to them, and pay the tax. And then if they wanted to get that tax back, they then had to file an amended 990T. And so they had to jump through some hoops, but they did get it sorted out. Okay, Anton, I think we can move on. Okay, let's talk about benefit limitations, and this will be for 2021. So the combined value of commuter transportation and transit passes that are excludable from an employee's income is limited to $270 per month. For qualified parking, which is treated separately, it also is limited to $270 per month. What that means is that an employee can elect to reduce their taxable compensation for any month in 2021 by up to $540 if they, in other words, $270 for qualified parking, and then another $270 for a combination of transit passes and van pooling. Now, I would think it's probably unusual for someone to be able to take advantage of both of those. I mean, again, in my experiences, you're either taking mass transit or you're parking at the garage at, close to where you work. An employee whose qualified transportation benefits for a period are less than the employee's compensation reduction can carry that over to the subsequent periods, and that can even go into a subsequent year. And what that means is, let's say, for example, as an employee, you had elected to reduce your compensation for qualified transportation benefits, and you got a $270 reduction one month, but the value of benefits that you were actually provided was $100. That $170 difference could be carried over and added to the limit for a subsequent period. One other thing is, an individual who is an employee of two unrelated employers can receive up to $270 a month in qualified transportation benefits from each employer. Now, if their employers are related, they're treated as a single employer, and you don't get the benefit of being able to use both. So it's important. Unrelated is the key term there. In terms of value and transportation benefits, a lot of times, this is a concept that sometimes is difficult. It's not actually just the actual cost that an employer incurs, but it's the fair market value of what's being provided. And of course, that lends itself to being somewhat gray, and sometimes it's not clear cut. But as the rules state, fringe benefits are generally required to be valued at fair market value. There are exceptions for employer-provided commuter highway vehicles. And also, this is a good one. If a transit pass is sold at a discount, the discounted price instead of the face value of the pass may be used as the value, and that's good. Now, the reason I mentioned that, just again, personal experience, Cap Metro has a program, and I'm not completely familiar with the details, but certain employers are eligible to buy passes at discounts and to provide to their employees. Now, you say, well, what difference does that make? Not so much maybe with Cap Metro, because I think their all services pass is maybe $90 something nowadays. I haven't checked, but it's certainly probably under 100 still. But if you lived in a location where it was much higher than that, whether or not you would have reportable compensation from exceeding the benefit limit, could be affected by the discount on the transit pass. Some employers provide in-kind qualified transportation benefits, which typically is on-site parking. The fair market value of the in-kind benefit will need to be determined periodically to confirm that the benefit does not exceed the maximum excludable benefit. Now, for anyone who's been in Austin for any amount of time, this may make sense, because essentially what's been happening for years now, and it seems to be accelerating even, is that most of the surface lots that used to be available downtown, if they don't already have a high rise on it, there's a high rise being in construction on it right now. And so there's a lot less parking available in downtown Austin than there was, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Less available drives demand. That means it costs more now than it ever has, and it continues to rise. And so you can't take come up with a valuation on a parking benefit that you had done 5 years ago and continue to use that, because it clearly would be out of date. Also, fair market value is not determined by the employer's cost. We had touched on that. The employer's actual cost of providing the benefit. It's the actual fair market value of the benefit in the market. Again, that just, it's a complicating factor. Qualified parking there's just a little more involved, and particularly in comparison to use of transit passes or van pools or commuter highway vehicles. Okay, which employees qualify to receive qualified transportation benefits? The exclusion for qualified transportation benefits applies only to employees, and employees defined as only common law employees or other statutory employees such as corporate officers. Common law employees are current employees or leased employees who have provided services on a substantially full-time basis for at least 1 year if the services are performed under the recipient's primary direction or control. Some of you may be familiar with PEOs, professional employer organizations. So more and more companies nowadays are actually leasing employees through a PEO rather than having their own employees per se. But those employees, leased employees would qualify provided they're there for at least a year and the employer exerts primary direction and control of their activities. Terminated employees can request reimbursement for qualified expenses incurred and paid only while employed. They can't do it for any expenses incurred after their termination. Partners, which would be partners in a partnership, more than 2% S corporation shareholders, sole proprietors, and independent contractors are not considered employees for this purpose and cannot receive tax-free qualified transportation benefits. Now, one thing, typically S corporation shareholders are actually employees of the S corporation. They receive W-2s, just like the other employees. Their benefits are treated differently than a typical employee. And so even though, again, while technically an S corporation shareholder may be a W-2 employee of the corporation, if they own 2% or more of the stock, they're not eligible for qualified transportation benefits. These individuals may be able to exclude certain benefits from income under the working condition fringe rules or the de minimis fringe rules, and we'll touch more on those later. Now, one thing that's different about qualified transportation benefits, for many fringe benefits, there can't be any type of discrimination. In other words, you've either got to offer it to everyone or no one can get it. Qualified transportation fringe benefits are not subject to the non-discrimination rules. And what that means is it can be a benefit that's provided exclusively to highly compensated employees or key employees or something like that. Okay. Okay, we touched earlier on, there's a couple of different ways that typically benefits are provided. Probably the most common, and again, I'm just speaking from my own experience. I don't know how representative that is, nationwide or anything like that, but they're done under a compensation reduction agreement. And so under a compensation reduction agreement, and employers offer employees the option of receiving tax-free qualified transportation benefits or equal amounts of additional taxable cash compensation. So if you're an employee and you have the option of getting qualified transportation benefits and you say, nah, I don't want them, just give me the cash. Okay, the cash will be taxable compensation to you. Sometimes it's worth it to take it, but that's just one distinction. So an employee who is offered the choice between cash compensation and qualified transportation and benefits, and who elects qualified transportation benefits, is not required to include the cash compensation in income if the election is pursuant to a compensation arrangement, if the amount involved does not exceed the applicable statutory monthly limit, which again, $270 per month in 2021. The arrangement satisfies the timing requirements, and proper substantiation is provided if cash reimbursements are made, and we'll talk about substantiation a little bit in a minute. And the related fringe arrangement otherwise satisfies any other requirements for the specific benefit offered. Now, here's something that's very important to note, because many companies offer their fringe benefits to their employees through a cafeteria plan. Qualified transportation benefits are prohibited benefits under cafeteria plan rules. So if an employer were to offer qualified transportation benefits under their cafeteria plan, the entire plan could be disqualified. And that would be kind of a big problem. Now, qualified transportation benefits can also be provided under reimbursement agreements. So in other words, rather than using a compensation or reduction agreement where your taxable income is reduced by the amount of the benefit, employers can use a cash reimbursement arrangement and exclude the reimbursement payments from the employee's compensation. So in other words, an employee incurs the costs, they then turn in an expense report and are reimbursed for the costs that they incurred. And just like under a salary reduction agreement, those reimbursements are not included in the employee's compensation as taxable income. One thing to note is that reimbursements made where the qualified transportation benefit has already been paid by the employee on a pre-tax basis are not excludable from income. And so if you had your taxable compensation reduced by a benefit amount, and then you also submitted a reimbursement, that would be taxable income to you. And the IRS considers any type of arrangement like that to be abusive tax avoidance transactions. So I don't know why. I guess that anything can happen, but you'd think that'd be kind of a no-brainer if you're already getting it tax-free, that you wouldn't try to get an additional reimbursement, but I'm sure it's been tried. A payment made before the date and expense has been incurred or paid generally is not a reimbursement. This goes back, remember when we mentioned on transit passes how the employer can distribute them in advance, even up to a year in advance. For reimbursement payments, the employer can't reimburse on a tax-free basis until the employee has actually incurred and paid the expense. And again, the exclusion is transportation passes. And for any expense that is reimbursed, the employee must provide proper substantiation. You may or may not be familiar with the term accountable plan related to expense reports and that sort of thing, but it is important to have proper substantiation, to get the tax-free reimbursement. And we can move on. Substantiation. Employers that make cash reimbursements must implement reasonable procedures to ensure that amounts equal to reimbursements were in fact spent for the qualified transportation benefits. Expenses must be substantiated within 180 days after they are paid. And again, this is just to make sure that if someone claims they're spending $250 a month, an employee claims they're spending $250 a month for their transportation, that they're actually spending $250 a month or not, and not something less. Okay. Employment tax treatment. For nonprofits, this is going to be really more relevant for whether or not the employee includes it as taxable compensation. But for for-profits, obviously there are some other tax implications as well. So an employer provided qualified transportation benefits with a fair market value that does not exceed the monthly excludable limits or exempt from withholding and payment of employment taxes. They're not reported as taxable wages on the employee's Form W-2, and they're excludable from the employee's gross income. If the employer provided benefits has a fair market value exceeding the monthly tax-free threshold, the excess amount is a taxable fringe benefit subject to federal income tax withholding, Social Security and Medicare taxes, and federal unemployment, and it's included as taxable wages on the employee's W-2. Now, amounts exceeding the monthly benefit also cannot be excluded as working condition fringe benefits or as a de minimis fringe benefit, and we're going to touch more on those later. The employer is responsible for determining the taxable amount, in other words, the value of the benefit, and must value commuter transportation, transit passes, or parking according to the applicable valuation rules for each benefit. When determining the amount includable in the employee's wages, any amount paid by the employee for a qualified transportation benefit is added to the monthly excludable limits, and the total is then compared to the benefit's fair market value. So here's an example. Let's say during 2021, an employer provided qualified parking with a fair market value of $300 per month, but they charge their employees $40 per month. In a situation like that, no amount would be includable in the employee's income because the amount paid by the employees, the $40, plus the amount excludable for qualified parking, the $270 per month, that sums to $310. It exceeds the fair market value, the $300 value, and therefore there's no tax consequences for the employee. Okay, this is where there's going to be differences at the employer level between a nonprofit and a for-profit. So limitation on employer's tax deduction for qualified transportation benefits. So an employer is not allowed an income tax deduction for any expenses incurred for providing qualified transportation benefits. Additionally, no deduction is allowed for any expense for providing transportation or any payment or reimbursement to an employee in connection with travel between the employee's residence and place of employment, except as necessary for ensuring the safety of the employee when unsafe conditions exist for the employee. One of the examples of, that I read as an example of unsafe conditions would be an employee who is required to transit, whether they walk or take the bus, through an area of high crime. But there are any number of things. There could be construction going on, anything that would make their transit unsafe versus what it would be for, normal conditions. The employer can actually take a deduction for providing that benefit. The deduction disallowance is the employer's actual expense for providing the benefit, not the value of the benefit to the employee. The employer's deduction disallowance for qualified transportation benefits includes amounts that are excluded from an employee's income through a pre-tax compensation arrangement. Therefore, employers that provide employees with qualified transportation benefits cannot deduct the expense incurred to provide the fringe benefits. So kind of think of it as if the employee is not having to pay tax on it, the employer can't take a deduction for providing it. An employer is allowed a deduction for qualified transportation expenses that are treated as taxable compensation to the employee, reimbursed by the employee. So in other words, if the employee incurs the expenses and then submits them for reimbursement, potentially the employer could take that as a tax deduction. Paid or incurred for transportation in a commuter highway vehicle, transit pass, or parking made available to the general public. Paid or incurred for transportation in a commuter highway vehicle, transit pass, or parking sold to customers, including employees, in a bona fide transaction for adequate and full consideration. So if an employee works at a place and maybe they have customers who come in and the customers that have to pay to park and the employees have to pay to park, the employer can take a deduction for their cost for providing that parking, for example. Okay. Okay, we'd seen de minimis transportation benefits and working condition benefits come up a couple of times, either as an employer who wasn't eligible for qualified transportation benefits may still get some benefit through a de minimis or working condition benefit rules, or that they can't use those rules. But basically, here's what they are. So a de minimis transportation benefit is any local transportation benefit an employer provides to an employee that has so little value that accounting for it would be unreasonable or administratively impracticable. For example, giving an employee local transportation fare because the employee has to work late, so long as the benefit is reasonable and it isn't based on hours worked. So for example, an employer can't say, okay, everyone who works 10 hours a day, we're going to pay your transportation fare. That would not be a de minimis benefit. And local transportation fare provided on a regular or routine basis doesn't qualify for the exclusion. Now, what's tough about de minimis is the IRS does not give dollar amounts. So again, it's just another gray area in the tax rules. And what's unreasonable or administratively impracticable, for one person may not be unreasonable or impracticable for another person. And so there is some gray there, which tends to complicate things a bit. Working condition benefits include property and services provided to an employee so that the employee can perform his or her job. It applies to the extent that the cost of the property or services would be allowable as a business expense to the employee if he or she had paid for it. And so examples include the employee's use of a company car for business and job-related education provided to employee to enable them, to do their job and better service clients and that sort of thing. So that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. If you're like me, you usually think of the question you want to ask, like the next day. And again, I have provided my contact information there. But if anyone does have a question, I'll certainly do my best to answer them.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. That was great. A lot of information. This is a really dense subject, and I think it's going to take a little bit for people to kind of digest it and figure out, like you said, where their questions may lie. But we do have a few that, if you can, we'll take a couple minutes to answer. May not be able to get to all of them because I want to make sure that our other presenter, Phil, has an opportunity to do his presentation as well.
Anton, one thing I would also ask, to the extent we have questions that we don't get to or that perhaps I don't know the answer to off the top of my head, can we follow up with folks after the fact?
Yes, of course. Yep, we're taking down all the questions that people are putting into the Q&A, and we're happy to distribute the answers once we know, or once we have time, or once we know the answers.
Okay, good.
So I'll do a couple now, and then we'll see if we have time at the end to answer any other questions. First one I have here is, if a driver is an employee or is using a fee-based van pool-like enterprise, can the driver be included?
That's a good question. The rules that I read clearly state that the driver cannot be included. It did not even address the situation, well, the driver is just one of the other employees. Based on the material that I went through and the things that I've looked at in terms of getting the presentation together, I did not see anything that indicated that there were exceptions where a driver could be included. And so at this point, I would say, to the best of my knowledge, no. Most of them clearly state that the driver cannot be included in the van pool or the commuter highway vehicle head count.
I'll do one more, and we're really seeing the questions pile in now, so we'll definitely try to get everybody their answers after the webinar in the following week. So this next question is there a minimum number of times a van pool rider has to ride in the van pool per month?
I have not seen anything to indicate the minimum number of times.
All right, so that's a pretty quick answer. So we have about 20 minutes left in the presentation, so I want to make sure that we give Phil enough time. I want to thank you again, Glenn, for giving us all of this information. I know this is a very dense and kind of difficult subject for people who don't do this day to day. So thank you so much for giving that to us today. Now I want to transition over to Phil, and to do that, I will give him control of the presentation. Let me do that now. And hopefully what Phil is able to do for us is to kind of help us conceptualize how this fits into the real world. and what are the trends that are happening for businesses in the nation that are affected by these tax rules. So Phil, whenever you're ready, feel free to start sharing your screen.
Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. Be right back. Okay. What I thought I'd do is just quickly go over who's offering the commuter tax benefits today. What do we know about the impact of them on mode use, which was of interest to many of the commuter assistance programs and transportation demand management agencies and transit agencies, and a little bit about how the benefit evolved and what opportunities are created. Some of this stuff will be covered what Glenn already talked about. So let me, sorry. All right. So who has access to subsidized commuting behavior? The Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts a national compensation survey every year, and they have tracked subsidized commuting, which has generally been transit benefits for the most part. It does not include parking. And what they found over these years is that currently, among the most current, 22% of state government employees have access. Now, access doesn't mean use, but it does mean access to the subsidized benefits. 8% of local government employees have it, 8% of civilian, which is essentially local government and private employees. And finally, 7% of private employees have access to subsidized commuting. It also provides more information on what has happened over time. And you can generally see it's been rather flat, if you will, from 2010, about a little over 5% of the employers had access to employees had access to subsidized commuting benefits up to then. So there are been some increases a little bit over time, but it's been rather stable. But the data also gives you an opportunity to look a little bit deeper. For example, if you look a little closer at the data, management professionals receive access about 1.5 times more likely to have access, I should say, than the overall rate. The people that make the most money, those in the highest 10% of wages, are 8.5 times more likely to have access than those with the lowest 10%. Those that work for large companies or large employers, I should say, are 3 times more likely to have access than those with small employers. And finally, 22% of the workers in education basically have access to subsidized commuting benefits. That would include things like universal passes. Now, why do employers offer subsidized commuting? The research has generally shown recruitment and retention, quality of the workplace environment tend to be the major motivators for why employers offer access to subsidized commuting. And it can include, of course, and Glenn used several examples, the need to perhaps reduce parking demands and shift the parking demand onto transit or van pools. At the time when the research was done, environmental benefits were occasionally mentioned. This is a rather old study, but it may be that it's mentioned a little bit more frequently nowadays, but it clearly was a selling point for some employers even as far back as 2002. Now, some of this may be obvious about why employers offer it. One, the types of employers that offer it tend to be those that are located near major transit services and typically serving a central business district or downtown area tend to be the most critical factor. If you have high quality access and good transit service, it is perhaps more desirable to employees, and the employer can see the value to their existing employees and maybe even potential employees. Now, this didn't necessarily mean to have access to rail transit. only. So it wasn't restricted to those that had rail transit. Clearly, those employers that had existing transit and van pool riders where they had employees that might have even expressed the need for some help financially to pay for fares, for example. And we also found that smaller employers perhaps were more likely to offer. Generally thinking of that as you're closer to the decision maker than you might be with a large employer or an employer that is located in multiple markets and may need to deal with equity issues and fairness issues across cities, for example. What we did examine too at the time was is there some relationship to the amount of benefits some employers offer? In other words, if they offer a lot of variety of programs in their cafeteria plans and their medical reimbursement and all those types of programs, were they more likely or less likely to offer subsidized commuting benefit access? And we didn't see a relationship there. So it wasn't a telltale that, okay, this employer offers lots of benefits, they're likely to offer subsidized commuting benefits. And again, employers that clearly saw value in the commuter benefits and what it could do for the business, including certainly helping solve parking problems, or they're environmentally minded. They had an image that they were trying to project and continue to project, or they're facing an issue of a corporate relocation, say from one part of a community to another, or two different communities, where they were facing the high cost of potential turnover. Again, those that were single employer sites you're clearly closest to the decision maker. At the same time, you would understand with more sites, you're more likely to face a greater range of barriers like distribution. How are we going to get it to our locations in the downtown, in the suburbs, or how are we going to get it to our facilities in the rural communities or in an adjacent metro area? Some employee characteristics that seem to play a role in the decision making was the degree or propensity of employee turnover. Generally, we were using, if you use the average cost of the person's salary as the cost to hire and retrain and get their productivity up to the person they're replacing, if you're using their annual salary, it can be quite expensive, and employers recognize that value. If they can retain employees, it can go a long way, and if this contributes towards retaining employees, there's a great benefit there. And of course, issues of income issues associated with the employees and union membership. In other words, in some places it's a negotiated benefit, or it's at least potentially on the table, or is not considered because they don't want to put it on the table. Looking at the behavior, because now we want to know. We know a little bit about, okay, does it make a difference from our point of view? You know, a commuter assistance type program. Did the commuters actually change behavior? We found in surveying and looking at studies done by others around the country that generally speaking, the commuter benefits did convince commuters who drove alone to ride transit. The majority of the new riders in these studies were reported they had previously drove alone. So it can go a long way towards changing mode behavior. Now, the other thing that we learned through some of these studies is that the commuter benefits not only induce changes to the commute behavior, but also the non-commute behavior. As Glenn pointed out, you know, there is a restriction on commuter highway vehicle, the 80-50 rule related to how much has to be used for commuting. But there isn't that definitional rule in transit. So we're in areas where they offer a universal pass or an eco pass or something similar, where somebody shows their ID, for an example, or they can ride for free. Once they get using it for work, they can now use it perhaps for other trip purposes. And I think that's an added benefit of offering commuter benefits and provide a lot of flexibility, not only to the employer, but also to the employee for participating. All right. I want to certainly leave some time for questions too. So I will add though, it does increase transit ridership, but not in all cases. Clearly, it's a function of things about transit availability. If you don't have high quality transit, high frequency transit service, it's not necessarily going to perhaps cause a big shift to transit initially. It also, because of some of these studies were back when some of the subsidies were relatively low in terms of they weren't on the order of $270 a month, for example, may not be significant, had not been significant enough at the time to influence behavior. And the question is whether we're supporting programs in place, such as an emergency ride home program. I think it's fair to say with transportation network companies and emergency ride home programs are now a little bit more pervasive than they were back when this study was done, that it may not have influenced the switch that it might do today. Just quickly, this is just to point out that this benefit, if you will, has evolved over time, including a lot of the parking information that Glenn covered earlier. I'm not going to cover that, but generally it started out with pretty much just transit benefits. And then bike benefit was added in 2009. And then the transit in 2015, there was parity established between transit and parking values, where previously parking was at a much higher value than transit and commuter highway vehicles. So the point being here is it's not a stagnant program. There are continual changes. I was talking to somebody the other day about the bicycle reimbursement. They didn't realize it actually had been, if you will, have been suspended until 2026. It may come back in a different form, may come back in a whole different, more higher value form under this Congress or future Congress. Now, I'm going to just skip through a couple of these just to note that there's a lot of flexibility. I think you heard a lot of this as Glenn was talking about a lot of the things the employers may need to make decisions on, like the discrimination thing. They can give it to any or all employees, for example. They could decide, for example, do I vary the amount? Do I make it, $50 in all my locations, or do I make it 50% in all my locations? So in Austin, it's this amount, and in San Francisco, it's that amount. So it gives them a lot of flexibility. They are not required to provide a transit pass. The big part of all of this benefit, if you will, it does require employer involvement. It does require the employer, even if they're not subsidizing, if they want to offer pre-tax benefit, they have to be involved. It's not something a commuter can do on his or herself. There are differences. We found, for example, annual elections, what you may be familiar with your benefits. They can have the flexibility of how allowing people when to sign in or drop out of the various program. We talked to one employer who had people that were changing basically with the seasons, and it became administratively burdensome to them, so they changed it to a quarterly election. So once you signed up for, say, the transit benefit, you were committed to it for 3 months at least. It gives a lot of flexibility. I would say, going back to the van pool, if you will, it's a 7-passenger vehicle. So a crossover allows it, carrying at least 4 people. So in many cases, we might consider this a large carpool, and that allows it to qualify, that we don't call it carpool. And actually, as he's indicated, van pools is the same as a commuter highway vehicle now. And I'll wrap it up quickly with a plug, if you will, for our Best Workplaces for Commuters program. One of offering these types of transit benefits can make you eligible to be named one of the 450 workplaces in the past year that have been best workplaces for commuters. As you can see on a table on the far left, over 60%, nearly 70% of all the employers offered a transit pass, for example, as their primary benefit to qualify as a best workplace for commuter. If you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. And here's my contact info, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil. I know we are almost at the top of the hour, but I will see if I can get one question at least.
Okay.
And then after that, I think what we'll do is we will, like we mentioned earlier, review all the questions and type out some answers and send that along with the recording. I do know that we've gotten some provider partners, in particular like van pool providers, that wanted to add additional context to some of these questions. So if possible, we will try to work that into our response as well. So don't be dismayed if we are not able to get to your question right now. Okay, so one question we have is, if an employer does not offer payroll deductions to employees to receive the tax benefit, can the employee file their van pool expenses on their annual taxes? That might be a question for either of y'all.
That sounds like a Glenn question to me.
I would say probably not, because in years past, unreimbursed business expenses would be an itemized deduction on Schedule A, subject to the 2% limitation of adjusted gross income threshold. And those have all been done away with. So unless you're self-employed, there's nowhere to deduct it on your personal tax return as an employee.
Thank you. Let's see if we can do one more question and then we'll end the webinar there. Let's see. Actually, we might be able to do two. One question is this being recorded? Yes, we are recording this webinar and we'll share the link out probably next week. One question we have is it a blanket max of $270 per month regardless of the size of the employer? So I think that's probably going to you again, Glenn.
Sorry, Anton, I missed your audio kind of went out a little bit. What was that?
Sorry about that. Yeah. So it is it a blanket max of $270 per month regardless of the size of the employer?
Yes, as far as it's $270 a month. Now there can be a combination between the commuter highway vehicle and the transit passes at $270 a month, and also qualified parking at $270 a month for a total of $540. But $270 is the monthly benefit limit.
Got it. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar for everybody. I do see y'all's questions. If you have any additional ones, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions regarding the subject. We know it's a dense and very hard to digest subject, so love to share the dialogue moving forward. I want to thank you all for joining and have a great weekend.
Thanks.